Elizabeth Whitmore set the teapot down so hard the fine china cracked, and every powdered head in that parlor turned to stare at the servant girl who'd forgotten her place. 7 summers she'd poured tea in the house that once carried her father's name. 7 summers she'd swallowed every insult like cold medicine. But the richest man in Virginia had just asked the one question nobody in that room dared answer: her name. Before we begin, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The teapot cracked, and for one long breath, nobody in the Whitmore parlor moved. Elizabeth stood over the tray with her hand still curled around the handle, and she felt the heat of 40 eyes pinned to the back of her neck. She did not turn around. She had learned over 7 long years that turning around only invited the strike. So she kept her spine straight and her chin level, and stared at the thin brown seam splitting down the side of the pot, and she waited for her aunt's voice to come cutting across the room like a switch. It came. Elizabeth. Just the name. Sharp as a slap. "What have you done?" "I'll fetch the spare, ma'am," Elizabeth said quietly. "You'll do no such thing until I've had a look at what you've broken." The whole room was watching now. She could feel it. The 3 girls arranged on the settee in their imported silks, the fluttering cousins by the window, the 2 neighbor women who'd come only to gossip about which Whitmore daughter would land the biggest fish in the county. And him. The man they'd all dressed for. The man half of Virginia had spent a month whispering about. Nathaniel Carter had not said a word since he'd walked through that door. Elizabeth had felt him look at her twice already. Once when she'd carried the tray in, and once just now when the pot cracked. Both times she'd pretended not to notice because a girl in her position did not notice things about a man like that. A girl in her position poured and stepped back and disappeared. "Come here," her aunt said. Elizabeth turned. Margaret Whitmore sat in the good chair by the cold hearth with her hands folded in her lap, like a woman at prayer, and her mouth was pressed into that thin line Elizabeth knew better than her own face. 52 years old, sharp-boned, dressed in gray, that cost more than she'd ever spent on Elizabeth's whole wardrobe. She held out one hand palm up the way you'd call a dog. "Bring me the pot." "It'll drip, ma'am. Bring me the pot, Elizabeth, before I lose what's left of my patience in front of company." So Elizabeth brought it. She crossed the whole length of that parlor, with the cracked teapot held out before her, and she felt every step land on her like a stone, and she set it in her aunt's waiting hand. Margaret turned it slowly, found the crack, ran one thumbnail down it, and then she looked up past Elizabeth at the man sitting quiet in the tall chair by the window, and her whole face changed, softened, sweetened, went bright as sugar water. "You must forgive us, Mr. Carter," she said. "Good help is so terribly hard to keep." Elizabeth did not move. Good help. That was what she was in this house. Good help. Not a niece. Not a Whitmore. Not the daughter of the man who'd built the north wing they were all sitting in. Just help. And not even good, apparently, on account of a teapot that had been cracked already for a week, and she knew it, and Margaret knew it too. Nathaniel Carter still hadn't spoken. He was a big man. She'd noticed that when he came in, the way he'd had to duck his head slightly under the doorframe, the way the chair seemed a size too small for him. 34, they said. Never married, they said, which at his age and with his money made him the most talked about riddle in 3 counties. He had a still face, dark eyes that didn't dart around a room the way most men's did hunting for something to want. He just watched. And right now he was watching her aunt turn a broken teapot in her hands and call a grown woman good help, and something in his jaw had gone tight. "Charlotte, dear," Margaret said, setting the pot aside, as though it had never existed. "Why don't you play for us, Mr. Carter? My Charlotte has a gift at the pianoforte, trained in Richmond." And just like that, the room turned away from Elizabeth again, the way water closes over a dropped stone. Charlotte rose. 27, the eldest of Margaret's 3 daughters, and by any measure the beauty of the county, golden-haired, cream-skinned, wrapped in blue silk that had come up from Charleston on a special order. She crossed to the pianoforte with the slow grace of a girl who had spent her whole life being watched and had come to depend on it. She sat. She arranged her skirts. She looked over her shoulder at Nathaniel Carter with a smile that had unhorsed lesser men. "What would you care to hear, Mr. Carter?" she asked. "I've no ear for it, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Play whatever pleases you." His voice was low and even, and it landed in the room like the first note before the storm. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since he arrived, and every woman in the parlor leaned toward it. Charlotte played. She played beautifully. Elizabeth would give her that. She'd heard Charlotte practice those same passages 100 mornings from the scullery over the slap of wet linens, and she knew how hard the girl worked at seeming effortless. It was a kind of labor, too, being ornamental. Elizabeth had never envied it, but she'd never mistaken it for nothing either. She stepped back to the wall where the help stood, and she folded her hands, and she made herself small. And that was when she caught Nathaniel Carter looking at her again, not at Charlotte, at her. Across the whole width of that music-filled room, over the golden head bent at the keys, his dark eyes had found the plain woman in the faded blue cotton standing against the wall, and they had stopped there. And he did not look away when she caught him. That was the strange thing. Most men caught looked away. He just held her gaze calm and unhurried, as though he had every right in the world to look at whatever he pleased, and what pleased him was her. Elizabeth looked at the floor. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to, and she was furious at it for that. She knew exactly what this day was. Everybody in the county knew. Nathaniel Carter, master of 10,000 acres out in Carter Valley, the richest unmarried man between here and the mountains, had let it be known he was of a mind to take a wife. And Margaret Whitmore had moved on that news like a hawk on a hen. She had 3 daughters to place. She had spent a month and a small fortune preparing them, and Elizabeth's only part in the day was to pour the tea and stay out of the way and be grateful she'd been fed. She did not look up again. The music ended. There was the soft patter of gloved applause. "Lovely, Charlotte," Margaret said. "Simply lovely. Now, Amelia, come and show Mr. Carter your embroidery. She's the gentlest hand in the county, Mr. Carter. And Rose." Margaret's youngest 19, and bouncing on the settee like a child at a fair. "Rose has such a wit. Rose, tell Mr. Carter that clever thing you said at the Harrisons." They came at him one after another, the way Margaret had drilled them. Amelia with her needlework soft-voiced, and afraid watching her mother for cues. Rose with her rehearsed cleverness, laughing too loud at her own jokes. And Nathaniel Carter received each of them with the same grave courtesy, nodding answering when answered, and giving nothing at all of what any of them were fishing for. Margaret's smile got tighter with every pass, because a woman like Margaret could read a room, and this room was not going the way she'd planned it. The fish was not biting. She had cast out her 3 brightest lures, and the biggest fish in the county was sitting there with his hands folded looking again and again at the wall. At Elizabeth. Elizabeth felt it before she understood it. She felt the current of the room begin to bend. She felt Margaret's attention swing toward her like a cannon coming about, and she knew with the deep animal certainty of a woman who'd survived 7 years in this house that she was about to become a problem. "Elizabeth," Margaret said too pleasantly, "the pot, the good one this time, and do try not to break anything else." "Yes, ma'am." She turned for the door, grateful for the excuse to leave, and she'd almost reached it, almost gotten free of that room and its eyes, when the low, even voice stopped her cold. "Who is she?" Elizabeth froze with her hand on the doorframe. The whole parlor went silent. Charlotte's fingers resting on the keys went still. Amelia's needle stopped. Even Rose stopped talking, which Elizabeth had not thought possible. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Carter," Margaret said. The woman by the door. Nathaniel Carter had not raised his voice. He didn't need to. "You've introduced me to your daughters, ma'am. All 3. You have not introduced me to her." Elizabeth turned around slowly. He was looking straight at her, and there was nothing in his face she could name. Not desire, not pity. None of the things men usually wore when they looked at a woman. Just a plain, steady attention, as though she were a question he intended to have answered. Margaret laughed. It was a light, brittle sound, the kind she made when she was buying time. Oh, that's only Elizabeth, Mr. Carter, my late brother-in-law's girl. She helps about the house. You needn't trouble yourself with her. My late brother-in-law's girl, Nathaniel repeated slowly. Has a name. Elizabeth, Margaret said, and Elizabeth heard the warning coiled under it, the private threat only she could catch. Elizabeth Whitmore. Now, Mr. Carter, might I offer you? Whitmore, he said, and something moved behind his eyes. Just for a moment. A flicker quickly gone, but Elizabeth saw it, and it stopped the breath in her throat, because it wasn't the look of a man hearing a servant's name. It was the look of a man hearing a name he already knew. You're kin to Thomas Whitmore, Nathaniel said. It was not a question. Elizabeth's mouth had gone dry. He was my father, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Thomas Whitmore was my father, sir. The room had gone so quiet she could hear the mantel clock ticking, could hear Amelia's small, frightened breathing, could hear the creak of Margaret's chair as her aunt sat forward. Elizabeth, Margaret said, go and fetch the tea. But Nathaniel Carter had risen from his chair. He rose the way big men do, slow and deliberate, and when he was standing, the whole parlor seemed smaller for it. He did not look at Margaret. He did not look at Charlotte, who had turned on the piano bench with her lovely mouth slightly open. He looked at Elizabeth, and he took one step toward her, and then another, crossing the room the way a man crosses a river he's decided to ford, no matter the cost. Miss Whitmore, he said, and he inclined his head. To her. A bow small but real, the kind a man gives an equal, offered to the woman in the faded cotton dress in front of a room full of silk. Elizabeth did not know what to do with her hands. Sir, she managed. Your father, Nathaniel said, was known to me, some years back, before he passed. He paused. He was owed a kindness he never lived to collect. I've been a long time looking for a way to pay it. Mr. Carter? Margaret was on her feet now, too, and the sweetness had drained clean out of her voice. I don't know what my brother-in-law may have. Ma'am! He didn't raise his voice, but he said the word in a way that closed her mouth. I'll thank you to let the lady speak for herself. She's had precious little chance to, from what I can see. Elizabeth's heart was slamming against her ribs. She had spent 7 years learning to be invisible. She had built the skill the way another woman might build a wall, brick by brick, insult by insult, until she could stand in a full room and let it move around her like she wasn't there. And now the richest man in Virginia had reached across that room and pulled the wall down with 6 words, and she was standing exposed in the wreck of it, with no idea what to say. I don't, she began. Sir, I think there's been some mistake. I only pour the tea. No, Nathaniel said, and there was something almost gentle in it now. No, ma'am, I don't believe you do. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he turned at last to face the room, Margaret white with fury, Charlotte forgotten at her piano, the neighbor women drinking it all in like buttermilk on a hot day. I came here today, Nathaniel said, on account of a letter. Margaret went very still. A letter came to me back in the spring. He went on, unhurried. From this house, regarding a matter of business, some land my family holds, bordering the old Whitmore tracks, and a dispute over the line that sat unsettled 20 years. It was the finest letter of its kind I ever read. Clear, honest. Knew the law better than my own attorney, and knew the land better than my overseer. It settled a thing 3 lawyers couldn't settle in a decade, and it did it in 2 pages. He paused. It was signed M. Whitmore. And I confess, ma'am, I rode over here half thinking to marry whoever wrote it. Margaret's mouth opened. You wrote that letter, Nathaniel said to her. It was almost kind the way he said it because they both already knew the answer. Did you, ma'am? The silence stretched. And Elizabeth, standing by the door, hands twisted in her apron, 7 years of swallowed words rising in her throat like floodwater, heard herself speak before she'd decided to. No, she said. She didn't. The word dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond. Margaret's head snapped around. Elizabeth. She didn't write it. Elizabeth's voice was shaking now, but she couldn't stop it. Couldn't have stopped it if the house had come down around her. I wrote it. I wrote all of them. Every letter of business that's left this house these 7 years I wrote. The land dispute with the Carter tract. I found the old survey in my father's papers. The line runs along the creek bed, not the ridge, and there's a deed from 1791 that proves it, and I signed it, M. Whitmore, because—" Her voice broke. "Because no one answers a letter from a servant." Nobody moved. Charlotte was staring at her as though she'd sprouted a second head. Amelia had both hands over her mouth. And Margaret Whitmore had gone the color of ash because the thing she had spent 7 years hiding had just walked out into the middle of the parlor and announced itself in front of the richest man in the county and two of the biggest gossips in the state. "That's a lie," Margaret said, but it came out weak. "That's a wicked, ungrateful lie, and I'll—" "Is it?" Nathaniel said. He reached into his coat, and he drew out a folded paper worn soft at the creases, like a thing that had been read many times, and he held it up. "I've carried this 3 months," he said. "Read it more times than I'll admit to. And I'll tell you what I noticed, ma'am, the very first time I read it." He looked at Margaret. "Whoever wrote this letter had a hand I'd know again anywhere. Small, neat, slants a little to the left. The W in Whitmore has a particular curl to the tail of it." He turned. "Miss Whitmore, would you do me the kindness of writing your name?" Elizabeth stared at him. "There's paper on the writing desk," Nathaniel said quietly. "Behind you." Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the pen. But she crossed to the little desk, the desk that had been her father's, that Margaret had claimed the day of the funeral, and she took up the pen, and she dipped it, and in front of the whole room, she wrote 3 words on a scrap of paper. Elizabeth Whitmore. The W curled at the tail. Nathaniel Carter took the scrap. He laid it beside the letter. He looked from one to the other for a long, silent moment. And then he lifted his head and looked at Margaret Whitmore, and Elizabeth had never in her life seen a man's face go so cold so quietly. "You put her name to no letter," he said, "but you put your own to all her work. Mr. Carter." Margaret was gathering herself now, hardening the way a cornered thing hardens. "You come into my home, you insult my hospitality, you take the word of a servant girl who— She's not a servant!" The words cracked across the room. "She's Thomas Whitmore's daughter." Nathaniel's voice had dropped low and hard as a struck anvil. "This is Thomas Whitmore's house that he built with his own money, that I stood in myself as a young man, when your brother-in-law showed me more decency than I've seen under this roof in the last half hour. And you've got his girl pouring tea in it and calling herself good help." He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. I don't reckon I'll take your word for much of anything today." Margaret's face twisted. And that was when the mask came off, the sweet parlor mask she wore for company, and Elizabeth saw underneath it the woman she'd lived with for 7 years, the one nobody but Elizabeth ever got to see. "You want the truth of her," Margaret said, and her voice had gone flat and vicious. "You want to know your fine correspondent, Mr. Carter? She's a charity case. Her father died owing money on this house, died with the roof half mortgaged and the accounts a shambles, and I took her in when I could have turned her out. I fed her. I clothed her. And this is my thanks to be called a liar in my own parlor, while she plays the wronged lady in front of a man twice her worth." Margaret's chin came up. "She's got no dowry, no portion, no name that's worth anything anymore. Whatever pretty letter turned your head, sir, you'd do well to remember she is nothing. She has nothing, and she will never be anything." The room held its breath. And Elizabeth, who had heard some version of those words nearly every day for 7 years, who had let them wash over her 1,000 times, because there had never been any point in answering, felt something inside her that had been bent double for a very long time, slowly, deliberately begin to straighten. She set down the pen. "That's not true, Aunt Margaret," she said. Her voice did not shake this time. Margaret turned. "What did you say to me? You said my father died owing money on this house." Elizabeth's heart was pounding, but her voice came out clear and even, and she was as surprised by it as anyone. "That isn't true. I've kept the books in this house for 7 years. I know every debt in it, every note, every mortgage, because I'm the one who pays them. My father didn't die owing on this house. He died with it paid clear." She took a breath. And the money you say you spent feeding and clothing me? That's the rents off my father's land. The land that's supposed to come to me. The land you've collected on for 7 years and never once entered in the books under my name. Margaret had gone white to the lips. You watch your mouth, she whispered. I've watched it 7 years. Elizabeth's voice rose just slightly, just enough. I watched it at my father's funeral when you took his desk. I watched it every night I ate in the kitchen while you told the county you'd taken in a poor relation out of the goodness of your heart. I watched it when you burned his papers, but you didn't get all of them, Aunt Margaret. You didn't find the box in the root cellar. I've got the deed. I've got the survey. I've got the note showing the house paid clear the year before he died. She was trembling all over now, but she did not stop. I am not nothing. I was simply never allowed to speak. The silence that followed was total. Nathaniel Carter was looking at Elizabeth the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing it. And Margaret Whitmore was looking at her the way a woman looks at a wall she thought was load-bearing that has suddenly begun to move. You're lying, Margaret said. But there was fear under it now. Real fear. There's no box. There's no... Then it won't trouble you if a lawyer comes to look, Elizabeth said, and she watched the words land. She watched them go into her aunt like a knife watched Margaret's face jerk with it, and she understood all at once standing there in her father's parlor, in her faded blue dress, that she had just done the one thing that terrified her aunt more than anything in the world. She had stopped being afraid out loud. Get out, Margaret said. Her voice was shaking. Get out of my parlor. Go to the kitchen where you belong and pack your things because you'll not sleep another night under this. She'll not go to the kitchen. Nathaniel Carter said it quietly, and yet it filled the whole room. He'd been standing this whole while by the writing desk, the letter and the signature side by side, in his big hands, and now he set them both down, careful and deliberate, and he turned to face Margaret Whitmore. And Elizabeth watched every woman in that parlor lean away from him the way you lean from an open flame. You'll not put her out of her father's house tonight or any night, Nathaniel said. And you'll not touch that root cellar, nor those papers, nor a single thing in this house, because come Monday morning, I'll have my own attorney riding out from Richmond to have a look at exactly what's owed to whom. And ma'am, his voice dropped, if he finds $1 of Thomas Whitmore's money collected under your name and spent as your own, I'll see you answer for it before every court in this state, and I'll pay the cost of it myself and count it a bargain. Margaret's mouth worked. No sound came out. You can't, she finally said. This has nothing to do with you. You've no standing here. You're a stranger. You came to court my daughters. I came to court whoever wrote that letter, Nathaniel said. And I've found her. He turned to Elizabeth, and for a moment, a long suspended moment, with the whole room watching. He simply looked at her, and something in his still face gentled, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all its iron. Miss Whitmore, he said, I'll not ask you a thing today you're not ready to answer. I know a bad hour to court a woman when I see one, and this is surely the worst I ever saw. A ghost of something crossed his mouth, gone as soon as it came. But I'll tell you plain, so there's no mistaking it, because you've had enough of things left unsaid in this house. I did not ride here to choose a wife off a settee like a horse at auction. I rode here because someone in this county had a mind sharp enough to end a 20-year land dispute in 2 pages, and honest enough to sign a name that wasn't theirs rather than let a good judgment go unheard. He paused. I came looking for that person. I did not expect to find her pouring my tea, but I'm not a man who walks away from the thing he came for, ma'am, just because it's dressed different than I pictured. Elizabeth could not speak. 7 years. 7 years of pouring and stepping back and disappearing, and no one. No one had ever once looked at her and seen the mind she'd hidden behind the tray. Charlotte had the face. Amelia had the sweetness. Rose had the youth. And Elizabeth had learned to believe that the one thing she had, the only thing that was truly hers, was worth nothing at all, because it lived where no one could see it. And now, A man had ridden 10 miles specifically to find it. "I don't understand," she said. Her voice cracked on it. "Why would you, a man like you? Why would you cross a room like that? For me?" "Because," Nathaniel Carter said simply, "everyone else in it was looking at me, and you were looking at the tea." He let that sit. "A man in my position," he went on, "learns fast to tell the difference between a woman looking at him and a woman looking at his 10,000 acres. I've had a great deal of the second kind, Miss Whitmore, and precious little of the first. And when I walked into this room today, 3 of the loveliest young women in Virginia looked at me like I was a deed they meant to sign. And you—" his voice softened again, "you looked at me like I was a man who'd come in from a long ride and might be thirsty. That's all. And I don't reckon you'll ever understand what that was worth to a man like me, because you did it without thinking. Which is exactly why it was worth so much." Margaret made a sound, some strangled, furious thing. "This is absurd," she spat. "You've known the girl a quarter of an hour." "I've known her 3 months, ma'am," Nathaniel said, not taking his eyes off Elizabeth. "I just didn't have her name till today." And he reached into his coat once more, and this time he drew out not one letter, but a thin bundle of them tied with plain string, worn soft at the edges, and Elizabeth's breath left her because she knew that string. She knew those folds, she had tied them and folded them herself. "You wrote me 11 times over the winter and spring," Nathaniel said quietly. "About the landline, about a bridge my men wanted to build over Whitmore Creek, about a debt of my late father's that touched your family's holdings, that you handled so fairly it shamed me." He held up the bundle. 11 letters signed M. Whitmore, each one wiser than the last. And somewhere around the 4th one, ma'am, I stopped caring about the land. His jaw worked. "I started riding to the post road myself to see was there another. And when the last one came back in May, and it was kinder than it needed to be over a matter of money, I made up my mind I'd find out who was on the other end of it if I had to knock on every door in the county." He looked around the parlor. "I did not expect the door to be this one, and I surely did not expect to be handed 3 young ladies at it, while the woman I came for stood in the corner with a tray. But here we are." Charlotte had stood up from the piano bench. Her lovely face had gone through shock and into something harder to look at, a slow, dawning humiliation, because she was whatever else, not a stupid girl. And she understood now that she had spent a month being trained and dressed and paraded for a man who had already given his attention to the cousin they'd all been stepping over for 7 years. Amelia was crying quietly, though even she couldn't have said whether it was for Elizabeth or herself. And Margaret Whitmore stood in the wreck of the afternoon she had planned so carefully. And Elizabeth watched her aunt's whole life strategy come apart in real time. The marriages, the money, the standing, all of it built on the quiet theft of a dead man's estate and the silence of the girl she'd made into a servant. And all of it now cracking down the middle like a teapot held too long over the fire. "You'll regret this," Margaret said. But it was hollow now. A thing said because there was nothing else left to say. "You'll both regret this. She has nothing, Mr. Carter, nothing. And when your fine attorney finds no box and no deed and no papers, and he will find nothing because there is nothing," her voice climbed, "you'll have thrown over 3 respectable women for a liar in a serving dress, and every family in this county will know it." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said. He turned to Elizabeth. "Is there a box, ma'am?" he asked. Quiet, just for her. And Elizabeth thought of the root cellar, of the loose stone behind the shelf where she kept the pickling crocks, of the tin box she'd wrapped in oilcloth the night after the funeral when she was 17 and terrified and grieving. And something in her had known even then, even as a girl, that she'd better hide the proof of who she was before her aunt found a way to erase it. "Yes," she said, "there's a box." "And is it what you say it is?" Elizabeth looked her aunt dead in the eye. "Every word," she said. For one heartbeat, too, the whole room hung suspended between the 2 women, the aunt who had spent 7 years building a house of lies, and the niece who had just in front of witnesses set a match to it. Then Nathaniel Carter picked up his hat from the writing desk, and he settled it on his head, and he offered Elizabeth Whitmore his arm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, It's a fine summer evening, and I've a mind to hear about your father from someone who loved him. Would you walk out with me a while where the company's better?" His eyes cut just once toward Margaret. "You needn't fear for your things. My man's outside and he'll see to it, not a hair on that root cellar's touched till the lawyer comes. And you needn't fear for your welcome back here either, because come Monday, ma'am, I've a strong feeling this is going to be your house again, and the person who ought to fear her welcome is the one who's had it these 7 years." Elizabeth looked at his offered arm. She looked at it a long time. 7 years, she had poured the tea and stepped back and disappeared. 7 years, she had told herself that the mind she'd hidden was worth nothing, that the girl she'd been before the funeral was gone for good, that Elizabeth Whitmore had died the same summer her father did and left behind only good help. And here was a man holding out his arm and telling her in front of everyone who'd ever looked past her that he'd crossed the whole state on the strength of that hidden mind alone. She did not take his arm. Not yet. Instead, she reached up slowly, and she pulled loose the strings of the apron she'd worn every day for 7 years. The plain gray serving apron her aunt had given her the week of the funeral, and she lifted it off over her head, and she folded it once, and she set it down on her father's writing desk. "That belongs to the house, Aunt Margaret," she said. "Not to me. I don't reckon I'll be needing it anymore." And Margaret Whitmore had no answer. For the first time in 7 years, the woman had no answer at all. Elizabeth turned to Nathaniel Carter. "I'd be glad to tell you about my father, Mr. Carter," she said. "He was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew." Her voice steadied. "And I think you'd have liked each other very much." She took his arm, and Elizabeth Whitmore walked out of the parlor where she had served tea for 7 years, past the sisters in their silk, past the neighbor, women drinking it all in, past her aunt, standing white and speechless by the cold hearth, and she walked out the front door of her father's house into the long gold light of a Virginia summer evening on the arm of the richest man in the state, and she did not look back once. Behind her in the emptied parlor, a cracked teapot sat forgotten on a silver tray, and it never once occurred to anyone left in that room to wonder who from now on would be pouring the tea. They walked in silence to the end of the lane, and it was Nathaniel who broke it. "You're shaking, Miss Whitmore." "I'm not." "You are. Your hand's shaking on my arm." He slowed his pace. "You don't have to hold it. You don't have to hold anything anymore if you don't want to." Elizabeth looked down at her own fingers, and it was true they hadn't stopped since the parlor. She'd walked out on the strength of one clean moment of courage, and now that the moment had passed, her whole body had begun to understand what she'd just done. "I've never in my life spoken to her that way," she said. "In 7 years, not once." Then it was 7 years overdue. "You don't understand." She stopped walking. "You'll ride back to Carter Valley tonight, Mr. Carter, and you'll sleep in your own house on your own land, with your own name on the door. And I'll—" Her voice caught. "I don't have anywhere to sleep tonight. You've made a fine speech in there, but come dark, that woman is still the only roof I've got, and now she hates me twice over." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "You think I'd let you sleep under that woman's roof tonight? I don't see where else there is. There's a good deal else." He turned to face her fully. "There's a widow in town by the name of Mrs. Hollis. Keeps a clean house, feeds better than most, and owes me a kindness I've never called on. You'll stay with her at my expense until the lawyer's done his work and this house is yours. And before you tell me you won't take a stranger's charity." He lifted a hand because she'd opened her mouth to do exactly that. "It's not charity. It's back wages. 7 years of running an estate for a woman who paid you in insults. I'd call boarding you a month the cheapest bill she ever ducked." Elizabeth closed her mouth. "You've an answer for everything," she said. "No, ma'am." A ghost of that same near smile. "I've an answer for one thing. Everything else I'm as lost as the next man." They reached Mrs. Hollis's before full dark, and the widow took one look at Elizabeth's face and asked no questions at all, which Elizabeth would remember for the rest of her life as the first ordinary kindness anyone had shown her in years. There was a room with a real bed and a window that faced the street, and there was bread and cold ham and a cup of tea that someone else had poured, and Elizabeth sat down at the little table and put her hands over her face, and did not cry, though she came close, because she had forgotten what it felt like to be waited on rather than to wait. Nathaniel did not come in. He spoke a few words to Mrs. Hollis at the door, tipped his hat to Elizabeth across the room, and said only, "The lawyer comes Monday. I'll come with him. Rest, Miss Whitmore. You've earned it." And then he was gone, and Elizabeth was alone with a full stomach and an empty week ahead, and the growing terrible certainty that she had gambled everything on a box in a root cellar, and a man she'd known for the length of an afternoon. That certainty got worse before it got better. It got worse the very next morning when the knock came at Mrs. Hollis's door, and it was not Nathaniel, but Charlotte. Elizabeth nearly didn't come down, but something in her the same, something that had made her set down the apron, wouldn't let her hide, and so she went to the front room and found her cousin standing in the middle of it in a traveling cloak. And for a moment, the two women just looked at each other, and 7 years of the coldest silence sat between them. "I'm not here for Mother," Charlotte said. "She doesn't know I've come. She'd have my hide." "Then why have you come?" Charlotte's chin trembled just slightly, and Elizabeth saw with a shock that her beautiful cousin, who had never in memory shown a crack, was near tears. "Because I've been up all night," Charlotte said, "and I can't stop thinking on something, and it's making me sick, and I had to say it to your face or I'd not sleep again." She swallowed. "When we were girls, before your father died, do you remember you used to help me with my sums? I couldn't make the figures come right to save my life, and you'd sit up with me by candle and walk me through them till I understood." Her voice broke. "I'd forgotten. I made myself forget. For 7 years I watched Mother put you in that apron, and I told myself you deserved it, that you were beneath us, that you were nothing, because it was easier than remembering you used to be kind to me. It was easier to look down on you than to look at what we'd done." Elizabeth stood very still. "Charlotte, let me finish or I'll lose my nerve." Charlotte pressed her gloved hands together. "I don't know if there's a box, Elizabeth. Mother says there isn't. Mother says you're a liar, and Mr. Carter's a fool, and it'll all come to nothing." She lifted her head. "But I don't believe her anymore. I saw your face in that parlor. Nobody lies like that. And I came to tell you." She took a breath. "I remember Uncle Thomas telling my father the summer before he died that he'd paid the house clear and meant to leave everything to you. I heard it. I was 14 and hiding on the stairs, and I heard it. And I never told a soul, because by the time it mattered, it was Mother's word against a dead man's, and I was afraid of her." Tears spilled over now. "I'm still afraid of her. But I'll say it to the lawyer if you need me. I'll say what I heard. It's the only thing I've got to give you back, and God knows I owe you more than that." Elizabeth's throat had closed entirely. Of all the things she'd braced for, she had not braced for this. She had spent 7 years believing that every soul in that house was against her, that the cruelty was total and shared. And now here stood the eldest sister, the golden one, the chosen one, the one who'd had everything Elizabeth had been denied, offering the one piece of testimony that could turn the whole case. Why? Elizabeth managed. Why now? Why not any of the years before? Because before, you never fought back. Charlotte wiped her eyes with the back of her glove. Half a laugh caught in it. "You just poured the tea and took it and disappeared, and it let all of us pretend it was all right. But yesterday you looked Mother in the eye and told her the truth, and I stood there, and I thought—" Her voice dropped. "I thought she's braver than every one of us. She's had less than any of us, and she's braver than all of us put together. And I couldn't be a coward one more day. I just couldn't." Elizabeth crossed the room and took her cousin's hands, and the two of them stood there gripping each other in Mrs. Hollis's front room. And it was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness would take longer than a morning, but it was the first true thing to pass between them in 7 years, and both of them knew it. "Monday," Elizabeth said. "The lawyer comes Monday. Can you be there? I'll find a way." Charlotte squeezed her hands. "But Elizabeth, you have to know. Mother's not sitting still." Her face darkened. "She was writing letters half the night. I heard her moving in her study. I don't know who to, But I know that look, and it means she's building something, and it won't be in your favor." She stepped back. "Whatever's coming Monday, she'll have moved first. She always does." And with that warning hanging in the air, Charlotte pulled her cloak tight and slipped out the door, and Elizabeth was left to sit through a Sunday that felt longer than any week, turning her cousin's words over and over. She'll have moved first, while somewhere across town in the house that used to be her father's. Margaret Whitmore was doing exactly that. Monday came gray and hot. Nathaniel arrived just after 9 with a lean, spectacled man he introduced as Mr. Pruitt, an attorney out of Richmond, and the three of them rode out to the Whitmore house together. Elizabeth on a borrowed mare, her heart going harder with every hoofbeat. She'd told Pruitt about the box on the ride out, the tin, the oilcloth, the loose stone behind the pickling crocks, and she'd watched the lawyer's careful face give nothing away. And by the time the house came into view, she'd half convinced herself that Margaret had found it, moved, it burned it, that she'd walk into that root cellar and find a hole in the wall and nothing in it. Margaret was waiting on the porch. She was not alone. Beside her stood a heavy-set man in a good coat that Elizabeth didn't know, and the sight of that stranger sent a cold finger down her spine because it meant Charlotte had been right. Margaret had moved first. "Mr. Carter," Margaret said, sweet as poured cream. "Mr. Pruitt, how good of you to come all this way for nothing." She gestured to the stranger. "May I present Mr. Josiah Bell, of Bell and Sons, Richmond, my attorney." Pruitt's spectacles glinted. "Bell, I know the name." "Then you'll know I don't lose," Bell said, and he smiled a smile with no warmth in it at all. "Gentlemen, this is a great deal of fuss over a servant's fancy. Mrs. Whitmore has been more than patient, but I'm afraid the girl's story doesn't survive contact with the record." He drew a folded paper from his coat. "The estate of Thomas Whitmore was settled 7 years ago, probated, signed. Here's the accounting entered with the county court showing the house mortgaged the debts outstanding, and the whole of it passing to Mrs. Margaret Whitmore as nearest kin and guardian of the minor child Elizabeth Whitmore, then 17. He held it out to Pruitt. "It's all quite legal, and quite final." Elizabeth's stomach dropped, because she knew that paper. She'd seen it before the false accounting, the one Margaret had filed, the one that showed a debt her father had never owed. And on paper, in the cold ink of the county record, it looked exactly as legal as Bell said. Pruitt read it slowly. His face didn't change, but Elizabeth saw his eyes stop once near the bottom. "This is your accounting," he said, "filed by you. Filed by Mrs. Whitmore's prior counsel," Bell said. "Reviewed by the court, accepted, 7 years ago." He spread his hands. "Whatever the girl claims to have found in a cellar, gentlemen, it does not overturn a settled probate. She was a minor. Mrs. Whitmore was her guardian. Everything done was done in her interest, and under the eye of the law." He turned to Elizabeth, and his voice went silky and pitying. "I understand you're an intelligent young woman. Then you'll understand this. There is no case. There is only an old grievance and a rich man's sympathy, and neither of those is evidence." For a moment, nobody spoke, and Elizabeth felt the old pull, the 7-year pull, to lower her eyes, to step back, to let the men with the papers decide what was true. Bell was counting on it. Margaret was counting on it. She could see it in her aunt's face, the small, triumphant certainty that Elizabeth would fold the way she'd always folded. She did not fold. "You said the house was mortgaged," Elizabeth said. Bell blinked. "I beg your pardon. The accounting. It says my father died with the house mortgaged to a Richmond bank. A debt of $2,000. She stepped forward. "Which bank, Mr. Bell?" The accounting doesn't specify." "It doesn't specify," Elizabeth said, "because there was no bank and there was no mortgage. My father paid the house clear in the spring of 1809, the year before he died, and I have the discharge note to prove it, signed by the lender, stamped paid." She turned to Pruitt. "It's in the box, along with the deed in my father's name, the survey, and a letter in his hand naming me sole heir, and dated 3 weeks before he died, written Mr. Pruitt after this so-called mortgage was supposedly taken out." She looked back at Bell, and her voice did not waver. "A man does not write a mortgage on a house he's just paid clear. And a man does not name an heir to an estate he's just drowned in debt. One of those papers is a lie, Mr. Bell, and it isn't mine." Bell had gone still. Prewitt had gone very interested. "There is no such note," Margaret said sharply. "There is no box. She invents it." "Then you won't object," Prewitt said mildly, "to us having a look in the cellar." "I most certainly do object. This is my house. You've no right to go rooting through my—" "It's Miss Whitmore's house," Nathaniel said. He hadn't spoken until now. He'd stood back by the porch rail with his hat in his hand and let Elizabeth fight her own fight, and Elizabeth had felt him there like a wall at her back, but now he stepped up beside her. "Or it isn't. That's the whole question, ma'am, and there's one quick way to answer it. Prewitt, Miss Whitmore, go on down to the cellar. Belle and I will wait right here with Mrs. Whitmore, and none of us will touch a thing." "You'll not set foot," Margaret started. "If there's nothing in that cellar," Nathaniel said quietly, "then you've nothing to fear, and I'll ride off your land within the hour and never trouble you again. But you're standing on that porch like a woman guarding a door, ma'am, and I've never yet seen an innocent party fight so hard to keep folks out of an empty room." The silence stretched, and Margaret Whitmore cornered made the one move a guilty person always makes one moment too late. "It's gone," she said. Everyone turned. "The cellar," she said, and her voice had climbed. "There was flooding in the spring. Water got in, ruined half of what was stored. If there was ever any box, it's long since rotted to nothing, and you'll find only a hole in a wall and mud, and I'll not have you tramping through my house to see it." Elizabeth's blood ran cold, because it was the perfect lie, unprovable, unanswerable. And if the box was truly gone— "Aunt Margaret," she said slowly, "how did you know it was in a wall?" The porch went silent. "I never said the box was in a wall," Elizabeth said. Her voice was very quiet now, and it carried farther for it. "I told no one where I hid it. Not Charlotte. Not Mr. Carter. Not Mr. Prewitt on the ride out. I said only that it was in the cellar. But you just said a hole in a wall." She took one step up toward the porch. "You've been down there. You've looked for it. And you couldn't find it because I didn't hide it in the wall at all. I only let you believe I might have. So you've spent your morning tearing at the wrong stones, and now you're standing here telling me it flooded and rotted. When the truth is, you don't know where it is any better than Mr. Bell does." Margaret's mouth opened and closed. Bell turned to look at his client, and for the first time, something uncertain flickered across the lawyer's smooth face. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "is there a box?" "There is no." "Because if there is," Bell said, and his voice had dropped all its silk, "and it contains a discharged mortgage and a will in the decedent's hand, then I have filed a false accounting with the county court on your representation. And that is a matter that touches my license, and I will not hang for your— There is no box." Margaret's shriek cracked across the yard, and every head snapped toward her, and in the sudden awful quiet that followed, Elizabeth watched her aunt understand what she'd just done. She'd broken. In front of her own lawyer, in front of witnesses, she'd lost the cool contempt that had ruled that house for 7 years, and it had shown everyone all at once exactly what she was. And that was the moment the front door opened. Charlotte stepped out onto the porch. She was pale and her hands were trembling, but she came out and stood beside her mother, and she looked not at Margaret, but at Prewitt, and she said in a voice that shook, but did not stop, "There's a box. I don't know where it is, but there's a box, and everything my cousin says is in it, because I heard my uncle say what he meant to leave, and to whom the summer before he died, and my mother knows I heard it because I told her so myself 2 years ago, and she told me to hold my tongue or lose my place in this family." She turned finally to her mother, and her voice broke clean in half. "I'm sorry, Mama. I can't hold it anymore. I'm so sorry, but I can't." Margaret looked at her eldest daughter as though she'd been struck. "Charlotte," she whispered, "what have you done?" "The right thing," Charlotte said, weeping now. "For once. Too late, but I've done it." And Elizabeth, watching, felt something she had not expected to feel in all her plans and preparations. She'd braced for the fight. She'd braced for Belle for the false accounting for her aunt's cruelty. She had not braced for the sight of Charlotte Whitmore choosing her publicly at real cost against her own mother. And it undid something in Elizabeth's chest that 7 years of insults had welded shut. Prewitt cleared his throat. "Well," he said, folding away Bell's false accounting and tucking it into his own coat, as evidence now rather than argument. "It seems we've a good deal to discuss. Mr. Bell, I'd suggest you and I have a private word about that filing before either of us says another thing in front of witnesses. And Miss Whitmore—" He turned to Elizabeth with the first real respect she'd seen from him. "I believe it's time you showed me that cellar." She led them down herself, past the pickling crocks, past the shelf where anyone would look, to the far corner behind the potato bin, to a floorboard that lifted out clean when you knew which one, and beneath it wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff with age. Exactly where a terrified girl of 17 had buried it, 7 years before the tin box. Elizabeth lifted it out with both hands. She did not open it. She turned in the dim of that cellar, and she held it out to Prewitt, and she found she could barely speak. "My father's whole life is in here," she said, "and the truth of mine. I've carried it alone 7 years. I'd be obliged if you'd carry a little of it now." Prewitt took the box gently, and upstairs on the porch, in the hot gray light of that Monday morning, Margaret Whitmore sat down slowly in the chair by the door. The same chair she'd sat in like a queen the day she'd handed her niece a serving apron. And she put her face in her hands, and for the first time in 7 years, there was no one left in that house who was afraid of her, and no story left for her to tell, and nothing at all left for her to do, but wait for the truth to come up out of the cellar and into the light, where everyone could finally see it. The box changed everything, and it changed nothing, because Prewitt was a careful man, and careful men don't celebrate before the court does. "The papers are real," he told Elizabeth that evening at Mrs. Hollis's, spreading them across the little table where she'd eaten her first free meal. "The discharged mortgage, the deed, the will, all of it in your father's hand, all of it witnessed. This is the strongest documentary case I've handled in 20 years. He took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "And I'll tell you plain, Miss Whitmore, so you're not blindsided, your aunt is going to fight it anyway." "How?" Elizabeth said. "You've said yourself the papers are real. Papers are real. Possession is 9 points of the law." He set the spectacles back on. "She's held that estate 7 years, collected the rents, paid the taxes, made the improvements. A judge looks at that and sees a woman who's kept the place going against a young woman who's been gone from it since Thursday. Your aunt will argue abandonment. She'll argue the will's a forgery. No, don't look like that, of course it isn't. But she'll say it, and she'll have Bell say it in silk, and it'll be your word and a dead man's handwriting against 7 years of her name on every tax roll in the county." He folded his hands. "We'll win, but it won't be quick and it won't be quiet, and before it's done, she'll drag your name and your father's name through every parlor in Virginia. You should know the cost before you pay it." Elizabeth sat with that. "And if I don't fight," she said, "if I take a settlement, some money, some quiet, and I go." "Then she keeps the house, the land, the name, and the lie," Prewitt said. "And your father's estate passes forever into the hands of the woman who stole it. That's the other price. There's always another price, Miss Whitmore. My job is only to make sure you know both of them." "I know both of them," Elizabeth said. She thought of the apron folded on the writing desk. She thought of 7 years of pouring tea. She thought of her father, and the box, and the girl of 17 who'd hidden the truth in the dark, because even then she'd known no one would believe her without it. "I'll fight," she said. Prewitt almost smiled. "I rather hoped you'd say that." But the fight came for her sooner than the court did, and it came the way Charlotte had warned it would, Margaret moving first. It started with the whispers. Within a week, the county knew. Not the truth, Margaret's version. That the Whitmore servant girl had thrown herself at Nathaniel Carter, that she'd invented a wild tale of stolen inheritance to trap a rich man, that poor Margaret had raised the ungrateful creature out of Christian charity, only to be repaid with slander and lawyers. It was a good story. It was better than the truth in the way lies often are, cleaner, simpler, with a villain everyone already knew how to hate. and it spread through the county like fever. And everywhere Elizabeth went, she felt it. She felt it in the mercantile when the conversation stopped as she came in and started again lower as she left. She felt it at church when the pew around her emptied a little when women she'd known her whole life gave her the small cold nod you give a stranger you've been warned about. She felt it most of all the morning she came out of Mrs. Hollis's and found Amelia waiting in the street, sweet frightened Amelia, the middle sister who'd cried in the parlor and never said a word. "I can't stay," Amelia said in a rush, glancing back over her shoulder. "If Mother knew I'd come, but I had to tell you. Charlotte's gone." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "Gone? Where?" "Mother sent her away. To our aunt in Baltimore. 2 days ago." Amelia's lip trembled. "Because of what she said on the porch. Mother said she'd shame the family, that she couldn't be trusted, and she put her on the coach herself. And Elizabeth," her voice dropped to a whisper, "Mother's telling everyone Charlotte went to Baltimore to escape the scandal you brought on us. She's using her own daughter's leaving as proof against you." The cruelty of it took Elizabeth's breath. Charlotte had done the one brave thing of her life, had stood on that porch and told the truth against her own mother, and Margaret had answered it by exiling her, and then twisting the exile into another weapon. The witness who could have won the case in a morning was 300 miles gone, and her going had been turned into ammunition. "Will she come back?" Elizabeth said. "For the trial. Will she testify?" Amelia's silence was answer enough. "Mother's got her frightened," Amelia whispered. "And Baltimore's far. And Charlotte." She looked down. "Charlotte's brave for a morning, Elizabeth, not for a season. You saw the most of her there is on that porch. I don't think there's more coming." Elizabeth watched the middle sister hurry away, cloak pulled tight, casting glances behind her, and she understood that she had just lost her only witness, and that she was now more alone than she'd been even in the worst of the 7 years, because in those years at least she'd known where she stood. Now she stood in a county that had decided over a week of whispers that she was a liar and a schemer and a servant who'd forgotten her place. She did not go to Nathaniel with it. She wanted to. That was the thing that frightened her most, how badly she wanted to ride out to Carter Valley and put it all in his lap and let his 10,000 acres and his steady voice make the county behave. But she didn't. Because a woman who solved her troubles by running to a rich man was exactly the woman Margaret was telling everyone she was, and Elizabeth Whitmore would sooner lose the whole estate than prove her aunt right. So she was alone in Mrs. Hollis's front room when the real blow came. It came as a letter delivered by a boy who wouldn't meet her eye, and it was from Belle. She read it twice. The words didn't change. It was a settlement offer. A generous one on its face. Mrs. Whitmore, out of the goodness of her heart and her wish to end this painful business, offered her niece the sum of $800 and a written character in exchange for Elizabeth's withdrawal of all claims against the estate and her signature on a document affirming that the will she'd produced was of uncertain provenance. $800 was more money than Elizabeth had ever held. It was enough to start over somewhere no one knew her name, and all she had to do to get it was sign a paper calling her father's last wishes a forgery in her own hand. She sat with the letter a long time, and then she did something she would not have had the courage to do a month before. She put on her bonnet and she borrowed Mrs. Hollis's little cart, and she drove out not to Carter Valley, not to Nathaniel, but back to the Whitmore house, to her aunt alone. Margaret received her in the parlor. Of course she did. The same parlor. She had Elizabeth shown in like a caller, and she sat in the good chair by the cold hearth, and she let Elizabeth stand. And for a moment, the whole 7 years hung in the air between them exactly as it always had. "You've read Mr. Bell's letter," Margaret said. "I've read it. Then you've come to your senses at last. Sit, Elizabeth. You needn't stand like a servant. Those days are behind us now." Margaret's mouth curved. $800. A character. A fresh start. It's more than generous considering, and it ends this ugly business before it ruins us both. "Before it ruins you," Elizabeth said. Margaret's smile thinned. "Before it ruins us. You think the county forgives a scheming girl? You think Carter marries scandal? You've a month of good feeling from a rich man. Elizabeth and I have 7 years of standing in this county, and I promise you when this is over, I'll still be a Whitmore of good name, and you'll be the servant who lied. Take the money. It's the only thing you'll walk away with, and you're a fool if you don't know it." And Elizabeth looked at her aunt, really looked at her the way she'd never let herself in 7 years of keeping her eyes on the floor, and she saw, for the first time, something underneath the cruelty that she'd never let herself see before. She saw fear. "You're frightened," Elizabeth said slowly. "Don't be absurd." "You are. You've been frightened this whole time." Elizabeth took a step closer. The $800, the character, the rush to settle before it goes to court. If you were sure you'd win Aunt Margaret, you'd never offer me a dime. You'd let me spend myself into ruin fighting and laugh while I did it. But you're not sure. You're not sure at all. Because you know what's in that box, and you know what Charlotte heard, and you know that if a judge ever sees my father's hand next to your filed accounting, you don't just lose the house, you go to prison for what you did. Her voice was steady, wondering. That's what this is. You're not buying my silence. You're buying your own safety. You always were. Margaret had gone very white. "Get out," she said. "In a moment." Elizabeth set the settlement letter down on the writing desk, the same desk where she'd folded her apron a month before. "I came to give you my answer in person because you gave me 7 years of insults to my face, and I thought you'd earned the courtesy of a refusal to yours." She met her aunt's eyes. "I'm not signing it. Not for $800. Not for $8,000. Because it isn't money you're offering me, Aunt Margaret. It's a lie. You want me to write in my own hand that my father's last words were a forgery, and I'd sooner lose everything I own than sign my name to that. He was a good man. He loved me. And I will not sell the last true thing he ever said to me, so you can sleep easy in a house you stole." For a long moment, Margaret Whitmore said nothing at all. And then quietly, in a voice Elizabeth had never once heard from her low and stripped of all its poison, she said, "You have no idea what it costs a woman to keep a family standing. No idea. Your father died and left 3 girls of mine in this house and not a dollar of my own, and I did what I had to do. You'd have done the same. You'd have—" "He left the house to me," Elizabeth said. "Paid clear. I'd have shared it with you gladly, Aunt Margaret. Every year of it. You never had to steal what I'd have given. You only had to ask." Her voice caught. "That's the part I can't forgive. Not that you took it. That you made me a servant in it when a kind word would have made me a partner." She turned to go. "Wait." Margaret's voice cracked. "Elizabeth, wait." Elizabeth stopped at the door. "If you take this to court," Margaret said, and now the fear was naked in it, "and you win, you understand what happens to me. You understand what a false filing means. Bells told me. I'd lose the house, the standing, everything, and then I'd stand trial, and at my age—" Her hands were shaking. "You'd send your own blood to prison. A woman of 52. That's what your justice costs." And there it was, the last card, the one Margaret had been holding all along. Not the law. Not the money. Guilt. The oldest weapon a family has wielded by a woman who'd spent 7 years proving she felt none of it herself, now asking her niece to feel it for both of them. Elizabeth stood in the doorway a long moment. "You're right," she said finally. "If I win, that could happen. And I've thought about it. I've lain awake over it, if you want to know, because whatever you are, you're my father's family, and he'd not have wanted you in a cell." She turned back. "So I'll make you the offer you never made me. Give me back my house in my name. Sign the estate over all of it in front of Prewitt. And I'll not press the false filing. I'll tell the court it was an error settled between us, no charges. You keep your freedom. You keep enough to live on, I'll see to it. But you sign it all back, Aunt Margaret, and you do it this week, and you never again tell a soul in this county that I lied." She let that land. "That's mercy. It's more than you showed me in 7 years. And it's the only offer I'll make, so think hard before you spit on it the way you've spit on me since I was 17. Margaret stared at her. "You'd give me my freedom," she said slowly, "and you'd lose your revenge." "I don't want revenge," Elizabeth said. "I never did. I only ever wanted what was mine, and a little dignity to go with it. You're the one who turned it into a war." She opened the door. "Think on it. Prewitt's in town till Friday. And she left, walked out through the parlor and the hall, and out the front door, past the rooms where she'd served 7 years, and got up into Mrs. Hollis's little cart and drove away with her hands steady on the reins and her heart pounding fit to burst. Because she'd just gambled the whole estate on the chance that a cornered, frightened, guilty woman might for once in her life choose the mercy she'd never given. She did not know if it would work. She found out 3 days later, but not the way she expected, and not from Margaret. She found out because Nathaniel Carter came to Mrs. Hollis's door on Thursday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his still face she'd never seen there, and he said before she could even greet him, "Miss Whitmore, there's been a development, and I'd not have you hear it from anyone but me." Her heart seized. "Charlotte. Is it Charlotte?" "No, Charlotte's safe in Baltimore." He turned the hat in his hands. "It's your aunt. She's gone to the county magistrate this morning, first thing." "Gone to—" Elizabeth's mind raced. "To confess, has she taken my offer?" "No, ma'am." And Nathaniel's jaw was tight. "She's gone to file a complaint against you. She's telling the magistrate you came to her house Monday and threatened her that you extorted her, that you demanded she sign over her estate under threat of false criminal charges, that you're using my name and my money to intimidate a widow out of her home." He looked at her steadily. "She's turned your mercy into a crime, Elizabeth. The very offer you made her, she's calling it extortion. And she's got Bell drawing up the papers, and she's got half the county already believing it, and the magistrate's a man who owes the Whitmores a favor from 20 years back." He drew a breath. "She's not fighting the will anymore. She knows she'd lose that, so she's changed the war. She's not trying to prove she's innocent. She's trying to prove you're a criminal, and if it works, ma'am, it won't matter what's in that box. A woman charged with extortion doesn't inherit an estate. She stands trial for it." Elizabeth felt the floor tilt under her. She'd offered mercy. She'd stood in that parlor and offered the one thing no one had ever offered her, and her aunt had taken it in her 2 hands and sharpened it into a knife and driven it straight back. Every kind word Elizabeth had said in that room, Margaret would now swear to as a threat. There were no witnesses. It was Elizabeth's word against a respected widow's in front of a magistrate who owed that widow a debt. "She was in that room alone with me," Elizabeth whispered. "No one heard what I said. No one heard what she said. It's just her word now, her word against mine, and this whole county's already decided which of us lies." "Not quite alone," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth looked up, and Nathaniel Carter, for the first time since she'd met him, allowed himself something that was almost not quite a smile, the grim, hard smile of a man laying down a card. "He's been holding a long while. Your aunt made one mistake Monday, Miss Whitmore," he said. "She was so busy planning to trap you, she never asked the one question that mattered." He set his hat down on Mrs. Hollis's table. "She never asked whether you came alone." Elizabeth's breath stopped. "Mrs. Hollis's stable boy drove your cart?" Nathaniel said. "Waited in the yard the whole while. And a yard's close to a parlor window on a hot day, ma'am, when the windows are thrown open against the heat." He heard every word. Your offer of mercy, her talk of prison, all of it. He came to me that same evening troubled, not knowing if he ought to say a poor boy frightened of getting crosswise of the Whitmores. Nathaniel's eyes held hers. "I told him to say nothing to anyone and wait. Because I had a feeling, Miss Whitmore, that a woman cruel enough to make her niece a servant for 7 years was cruel enough to turn a kindness into a crime. And I wanted a witness to what really happened in that room, held quiet till the moment she reached for the knife." The whole room seemed to go very still. "She's walked into the magistrate this morning," Nathaniel said softly, "to swear you threatened her. And there's a boy in my keeping who heard with his own ears that you offered her mercy she didn't deserve, and heard her admit in her own words unprompted exactly what she'd done to your father's estate, and exactly why she feared the prison it would earn her." He picked his hat back up. "She's not just failed to trap you, ma'am. She's confessed to a witness, and then filed a false complaint on top of it, and both of those are crimes in their own right." He looked at her steadily. Your aunt spent 7 years believing you were too meek to fight and too poor to matter. And this morning, thinking she'd finally beaten you, she reached out to strike the last blow and put her whole hand straight into the trap she never knew was set. Elizabeth sat down slowly in Mrs. Hollis's chair. 7 years of silence. 7 years of pouring tea and keeping her eyes down and swallowing every insult of a girl who'd hidden the truth in a cellar because she knew no one would believe her without it. And now the truth had a witness. Now her aunt's own cruelty, the thing that had ruled that house so long, had reached 1 inch too far and closed on nothing but empty air, and closed hard enough to break the hand that reached. Then it's over, Elizabeth said quietly. She can't win. Not against a witness. Not against the box. No, ma'am, Nathaniel said. She can't win. And then his voice gentled, and the man underneath the strategy showed through. But I'll tell you what troubles me still, Elizabeth, and I'll say it plain because you've had enough of things left unsaid. You offered that woman mercy. In that parlor. After everything she did to you, you stood there and offered her freedom, and enough to live on, and no charges brought, and she answered it by trying to send you to prison. He turned the hat in his hands. Most folks after that would want blood. Would take that witness and that box straight to the magistrate and see her ruined all the way down. And no soul in this county would blame you for it. He met her eyes. So I have to ask, ma'am, and your answer tells me most of what I'll ever need to know about you. Now that you can destroy her, now that she's handed you the means after all she's done. He paused. Do you still want to? And Elizabeth Whitmore sat in the quiet of Mrs. Hollis's front room, with the whole weight of 7 years on one side of the scale, and a witness, and a box, and every right to revenge on the other. And she understood that Nathaniel Carter was not asking her a question about her aunt at all. He was asking her who she meant to be now that she was finally free to be anyone. No, Elizabeth said. She said it slowly, the way you say a thing you're only sure of as it leaves your mouth. No, I don't want to destroy her. I thought I might. I thought all those years that if the day ever came, I'd want to watch her lose everything the way she made me lose it. She looked up at Nathaniel. But I stood in that parlor Monday, and I heard myself offer her mercy, and I meant it. Not because she deserved it, because I didn't want to become her to get free of her. Her voice steadied. If I take that witness to the magistrate and send a woman of 52 to prison, I win the estate, and I lose the one thing this whole fight was ever about. I lose the right to say I'm nothing like her. Nathaniel was quiet a long moment. That's the answer I hoped for, he said. And I'll be honest, Miss Whitmore, it's a harder road than the other one. Mercy always is. A woman who ruins her enemy is safe. A woman who spares her has to live alongside her. He set his hat back down. But it's your road, and I'll not talk you off it. I'll only ask, how do you mean to walk it? Because your aunt's already in the magistrate's office swearing you're a criminal. Mercy's a fine thing, but it won't stop the charge she's filing this morning. If you don't fight, you don't go to prison for extortion, ma'am, but you don't get your house back either. She'll just keep it and keep lying, and you'll have spared her for nothing. I know, Elizabeth said. That's why I'm not going to spare her the truth. Only the punishment. She stood. Take me to the magistrate, she said. Now, before she finishes filing. I'll bring the box and the boy both, and I'll lay it all in front of him, every paper, every word that stable boy heard. And then I'll do the one thing she'll never expect. Her chin came up. I'll ask him to charge her with nothing. Nathaniel stared at her. Elizabeth, let me finish. Her voice had found its iron. If I ask for prison, it's her word against mine, and a magistrate who owes her. But if I walk in there and lay down proof enough to hang her, and then ask for mercy in front of the whole room, then I'm not the scheming servant she's painted. I'm the woman who could have destroyed her and chose not to. Let the county see that. Let them see which of us the truth actually belongs to. She can't fight mercy, Mr. Carter. There's no counter to it. If she rages, she looks like the villain. If she weeps, she looks guilty. And either way, everyone in that room watches her be spared by the girl she called nothing. She took a breath. That's not weakness. That's the strongest hand I've got. And I mean to play it. And for the first time since she'd known him, Nathaniel Carter looked at Elizabeth Whitmore, not with the steady attention he'd shown from the first, but with something closer to awe. "You planned that just now," he said, "standing in this room, in the space of a breath." "I've had 7 years to think," Elizabeth said, "and nothing to do it out loud until now." The magistrate's office was already crowded when they arrived, because word of a Whitmore filing traveled fast, and the county had come out to watch the scandal it had been feeding on all month. Margaret was there seated in the front with Belle at her elbow, and Elizabeth saw the flicker of triumph on her aunt's face as she came through the door, the look of a woman watching her trap spring exactly on schedule. "There she is," Margaret said loud enough for the room. "The girl herself, come to answer for what she did, I hope. Magistrate Holloway, I've told you what she threatened me with in my own parlor." "You've told him a lie," Elizabeth said. The room went quiet. Margaret's mouth tightened. "I said I'd answer for what I did in your parlor, Aunt Margaret." Elizabeth went on walking to the front. "And I will, in front of everyone. I've nothing to hide anymore. That was always your privilege, not mine." She turned to the magistrate, a gray man behind a wide desk, who was watching her with careful, unfriendly eyes. "Mr. Holloway, my aunt says I came to her house Monday and threatened her with false charges unless she signed over her estate. She's half right. I did go to her house. I did ask her to sign it over. She let that sit. Because it's mine, and I can prove it, every word of it. And when I'm done proving it, sir, I'm going to ask you for something that'll surprise this whole room, but I'll get to that. First, the truth." She set the tin box on the magistrate's desk. "You're welcome to examine every paper in here yourself," she said. "But Mr. Pruitt's had them a week, and he'll tell you what they are." Pruitt stepped forward and laid them out one at a time. The deed in Thomas Whitmore's hand, the discharged mortgage stamped, paid the will, naming Elizabeth sole heir, dated 3 weeks before her father's death. "And here," Pruitt said quietly, producing the last, "is the accounting Mrs. Whitmore's counsel filed with this very court 7 years ago, swearing the house was mortgaged and the estate insolvent. Compare the dates yourself, sir. The mortgage was discharged the year before Mr. Whitmore died. There was no debt. The filing is false, and a false filing made to seize a minor's inheritance is a crime." The room stirred. Elizabeth watched the faces the county that had spent a month believing Margaret's story begin one by one to tilt. "That proves nothing," Belle said, rising. "Papers can be forged. The girls had 7 years alone in that house to manufacture whatever she didn't manufacture the stable boy." Nathaniel Carter stepped forward, and behind him came a thin, frightened boy of perhaps 15, twisting his cap in his hands. "This is Samuel Reed," Nathaniel said. "He drives Mrs. Hollis's cart. He drove Miss Whitmore to the Whitmore house Monday last, and he waited in the yard under an open parlor window on a hot day. Tell them what you heard, son, the truth and nothing added to it." The boy's voice shook, but he told it. He told how Miss Elizabeth had offered her aunt the estate back, with no charges, pressed enough to live on her freedom kept. He told how Mrs. Whitmore had spoken of prison, and of what her false filing would cost her if it came to light, in her own words, unprompted an admission of the very crime she was now denying. He told it plain, a poor boy too frightened to invent a thing, and the room heard it that way. Margaret had gone the color of ash. "He's lying," she said, but it came out cracked. "He's Carter's boy. Carter's paid him." "He's Mrs. Hollis's boy," Nathaniel said, "and I paid him nothing but the truth's protection. You may ask him anything you like, ma'am. You may have your Mr. Bell take him apart. He'll say the same because it's what happened." And Bell, looking at the boy and at the box and at the dates on his own client's filing, did the thing a smart lawyer does when his client has been caught in a crime he didn't know she'd committed. He sat down. He put a careful inch of distance between himself and Margaret Whitmore, and he said very quietly, "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe I must withdraw." Margaret turned on him. "You can't. I filed that accounting on your word that it was true," Bell said. "It wasn't. You've exposed me to charges of my own, madam. I'll not add to them by defending a false complaint against a woman who's just proven every claim she made." He gathered his papers. "I'm done." And Margaret Whitmore sat alone in the front of that room, abandoned by her own lawyer, her filing in ruins, her theft laid bare in front of every soul in the county, the box open on the desk, and the boy's testimony hanging in the air. And she understood Elizabeth watched her, understand that it was over. Not the way she'd planned. The exact opposite way. She had come to spring a trap, and had walked into ruin, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the sentence. Magistrate Holloway looked down at the papers a long time. When he lifted his head, his careful, unfriendly eyes had changed. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said heavily, "I've known your family 20 years. I'll not pretend this gives me any pleasure. But the record's plain. The filing's false. The estate's not yours and never was. And the complaint you brought this morning against your niece is on the evidence of your own admission itself, a false swearing." He set the papers down. "That's 2 crimes, madam. The theft of a minor's estate and the filing of a false complaint to cover it. Either one carries prison. Both together. Mr. Holloway." Elizabeth's voice cut across the room and every head turned. "Before you finish," she said, "I asked to say a thing, and I'd ask you to hear it before you sentence anyone." The magistrate frowned. "Miss Whitmore, this woman tried to have you charged as a criminal not an hour ago. You've every right to see her answer for it." "I know I have," Elizabeth said, "and I'm asking you not to." The room went utterly silent. Margaret's head came up slowly, disbelieving. "I'm asking you to charge her with nothing," Elizabeth said, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried to every corner. "Not the false filing, not the false complaint, nothing." She turned to face the room, the whole county that had called her a liar for a month. "Give me back my father's house and my father's name, and let the record show plain that everything I said was true. That's all I want. The truth on the books where it belongs. But the woman," she looked at Margaret, "she's my father's family. He'd not have wanted her in a cell whatever she did, and I find I don't want it either. She's 52 years old, and she's just lost everything she built her life on. That's punishment enough. I'll not add prison to it." "Miss Whitmore," the magistrate said slowly, "do you understand what you're forgiving? This woman made you a servant in your own home, stole your inheritance, and this very morning tried to send you to prison to keep it." "I understand it better than anyone alive," Elizabeth said. "I lived every day of it for 7 years. She looked at her aunt. "And that's exactly why I won't do to her what she did to me. She spent 7 years teaching me that power means grinding down whoever's beneath you. I'd rather show all of you, that she taught me wrong." Nobody in that room moved. And Margaret Whitmore, who had not wept once in 7 years, who had stood on her porch and shrieked and schemed and never once broken, Margaret Whitmore put her face in her hands and began silently to shake. Not the performed tears of the parlor. Something rawer from somewhere deeper. The sound of a proud, hard woman confronted all at once with a mercy she had no idea what to do with, from the one person on earth she'd given no reason to grant it. "Why?" she said when she could speak. She lifted her ravaged face to Elizabeth. "Why would you? After what why?" "Because my father loved you," Elizabeth said simply. "You were his brother's wife. He took you in when your husband died, same as you were meant to take me in when mine did. He'd have shared everything with you, and he did until the day he passed, and you turned around and made his daughter a servant." Her voice caught, then steadied. "But he was a good man, Aunt Margaret. The best I ever knew. And the way I honor him isn't by becoming you. It's by being what he'd have wanted even to you. Especially to you." She looked away. "That's not for your sake. It never was. It's for his, and for mine. So I can look in a glass and know whose daughter I am." The magistrate cleared his throat, and his gray voice had gone rough. "In 20 years on this bench," he said, "I've not seen the like." He picked up his pen. "Let the record show the estate of Thomas Whitmore restored in full to his daughter and lawful heir Elizabeth Whitmore. Let it show every claim she made this day proven true on documentary evidence and sworn testimony. And let it show—" He paused. that at the express and unforced request of the wronged party, no charges are brought against Margaret Whitmore, who leaves this room a free woman by the mercy of the niece she wronged. He set the pen down. Miss Whitmore, the house is yours. It always was. I'm only sorry it took this court 7 years to say so, and it was done. The county filed out slow, and Elizabeth felt the change in them as they passed the small nods that were real. This time, the murmurs that had turned all the way around the women who'd emptied the pew beside her at church, now unable to meet her eye for a different reason than before. She'd walked in a scheming servant. She was walking out something else entirely, and everyone in that room had watched it happen. Margaret was the last to rise. She came to Elizabeth slowly, and stood before her smaller somehow than she'd ever seemed. And for a long moment the two women who'd shared 7 years of the coldest silence simply looked at each other. I don't know how to thank you, Margaret said. I've no right to, and I won't insult you by pretending I understand it. But I'll go quiet, Elizabeth. Wherever you'll let me go, I'll not trouble you again, and I'll not say another word against you in this county or any other. You have my... Her voice broke. You have my word for whatever a thing like that is worth from a woman like me. Where will you go? Elizabeth asked. I don't know. My sister in Baltimore, perhaps? Where Charlotte is. A ghost of pain crossed her face. Charlotte. God, what I did to Charlotte for telling the truth. Charlotte's coming home, Elizabeth said. Margaret went still. I sent for her this morning, Elizabeth said. Before any of this. Prewitt posted the letter and the coach fare both. She stood on that porch and told the truth against you at the cost of everything, and I'll not have her exiled for the one brave thing anyone in that house ever did for me. She's coming home, Aunt Margaret, to her home. And you. Elizabeth's voice softened. You may stay in it, if you can live under a roof that isn't yours, and treat the people in it kindly, which is the exact thing you never let me do. She held her aunt's eyes. It's the same offer I made you Monday. I'm making it again, not because you've earned it, because I'd rather offer it twice than become a woman who wouldn't offer it at all. And Margaret Whitmore, who had made her niece a servant for 7 years, stood in the emptying magistrate's office and wept openly in front of the last few stragglers, undone completely, not by ruin, which she'd braced for, but by a kindness she'd done nothing on this earth to deserve, offered twice by a girl she'd spent 7 years trying to erase. It was Nathaniel who drove her home, not Margaret Elizabeth. He handed her up into his own carriage, this time, not Mrs. Hollis's cart, and they rode out toward the Whitmore house through the long gold light of a Virginia evening. And for a good while, neither of them spoke, because some things are too large for talk right after they happen. You could have ruined her, Nathaniel said at last. I gave you the means to do it, handed you the boy and the box both, and you laid them down in front of the whole county and asked for nothing but the truth on the books. He shook his head slowly. I've built a life on knowing what people are, Miss Whitmore. Reading them quick and rarely wrong, and I confess I don't fully know what to make of you even now. I'm not a mystery, Mr. Carter, Elizabeth said. I'm just a woman who spent 7 years being shown exactly what cruelty looks like from underneath and decided she'd not do it to anyone else. That's all. There's no great secret in it. There's every secret in it, Nathaniel said. Most folks who suffer learn to hand it down. You learn to stop it. That's rarer than you know. He was quiet a moment. Elizabeth, I'd meant to wait, to do this proper when the dust had settled and you'd had time to find your feet in your own house. But I find I'm not a patient enough man after all when it comes to a thing I've already made up my mind on. Her heart began to pound. You know why I came to that parlor, he said. You've known since the first day. I came for the mind that wrote those letters. But I'll tell you now, what I didn't know then, that the mind was the smallest part of it. He kept his eyes on the road, and his voice, so steady in every room she'd ever seen him in, was not quite steady now. I've watched you these weeks fight for what was yours without once losing what you are. I've watched you offer mercy to a woman who'd have watched you hang. And somewhere in it, Miss Whitmore, I stopped admiring you and started... He stopped, started again. I'm a plain man with more land than sense and not much practice at this. So I'll just say it. I don't want to hand you back your father's house and ride off to mine and see you Sundays across a church aisle. I want to build a life beside you. I'm asking you to marry me. Not to save you, God knows you've proven you need no saving. To stand alongside you. If you'll have a man who came looking for a letter and found the whole reason for the rest of his days. Elizabeth's eyes had filled. For 7 years no one had wanted her. Not the mind, not the woman, not any part. And now a man had ridden across a state for the one thing she'd believed was worth nothing, and stayed for all the rest, and was sitting beside her in the gold light, asking to spend his life within reach of her. But she'd waited too long, and paid too much, and fought too hard for her own name to give it away without saying the one thing that mattered. "Ask me again in a month," she said softly. Nathaniel's face didn't fall, but something in it went carefully still. "A month. When I'm standing in my own house," Elizabeth said, "with my own name on the deed and my own life in my own 2 hands for the first time since I was 17. When I'm not a servant, just freed, or a woman just rescued or anything, but Elizabeth Whitmore whole and standing on her own ground." She reached over, and she took his hand and she held it. "Because I mean to say yes, Nathaniel. I've known I'd say yes since you crossed that room. But I've spent 7 years being something other people made me. And before I belong to anyone, even to a good man, even gladly, I need to belong to myself first. Just for a little while. You understand that? I think you're the one man in the world who would." And Nathaniel Carter looked down at her hand in his, and then up at her face, and the slow, rare smile came to him at last, full and unguarded. "A month," he said. "I've waited 3 already on the strength of letters signed with the wrong name. I reckon I can wait 1 more for the right one." He closed his fingers around hers. "Take your month, Elizabeth. Stand on your own ground. And when you're ready, not before you know where to find me. I'll not go anywhere. I've found what I rode out for. I can be patient now I know it's there." The carriage came up the lane at last, and the Whitmore house rose ahead of them in the evening light. The house where she'd poured tea for 7 years. The house that was hers, now deed and name and all. And Elizabeth Whitmore sat forward to look at it, and for the first time in her life, she looked at that house not as a place she served in, but as a place she was coming home to. "No," Elizabeth said. She said it slowly, the way you say a thing you're only sure of as it leaves your mouth. "No, I don't want to destroy her. I thought I might. I thought all those years that if the day ever came, I'd want to watch her lose everything the way she made me lose it." She looked up at Nathaniel. "But I stood in that parlor Monday, and I heard myself offer her mercy, and I meant it. Not because she deserved it, because I didn't want to become her to get free of her." Her voice steadied. "If I take that witness to the magistrate and send a woman of 52 to prison, I win the estate and I lose the one thing this whole fight was ever about. I lose the right to say I'm nothing like her." Nathaniel was quiet a long moment. "That's the answer I hoped for," he said. "And I'll be honest with you, Miss Whitmore, it's a harder road than the other one. Mercy always is. A woman who ruins her enemy is safe. A woman who spares her has to live alongside her." He looked at her steadily. "But it's your road, and I'll not talk you off it. I'll only ask one thing. How do you mean to walk it? Because your aunt's already in the magistrate's office this morning swearing you're a criminal. Mercy's a fine thing, but it won't stop the charge she's filing. If you don't fight, you don't go to prison for extortion, but you don't get your house back either. She'll keep it and keep lying, and you'll have spared her for nothing." "I know," Elizabeth said. "That's why I'm not going to spare her the truth, only the punishment." She stood, and she felt something settle in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she'd been picking at for 7 years. "Take me to the magistrate," she said. "Now, before she finishes filing, I'll bring the box and the boy both, and I'll lay it all down in front of that room, every paper, every word that stable boy heard, and then I'll do the one thing she'll never in this world expect." Her chin came up. "I'll ask him to charge her with nothing." Nathaniel stared at her. "Elizabeth, let me finish." Her voice had found its iron. If I ask for prison, it's my word against hers in front of a magistrate who owes her a favor. But if I walk in there with proof enough to hang her and then lay it down and ask for mercy in front of the whole room, I'm not the scheming servant she's been painting to every parlor in this county. I'm the woman who could have destroyed her and chose not to. Let them all see that. Let them see which one of us the truth actually belongs to." She took a breath. She cannot fight mercy, Nathaniel. There's no answer to it. If she rages, she looks like the villain she is. If she weeps, she looks guilty. Either way, everyone in that room watches her be spared by the girl she called nothing in front of the same county she spent a month turning against me. She turned. "That's not weakness. That's the strongest hand I've got, and I mean to play it all the way down." For the first time since she'd known him, Nathaniel Carter looked at Elizabeth Whitmore with something that went well past admiration. "You planned that just now," he said quietly, "standing in this room, in the space of one breath." "I've had 7 years to think," Elizabeth said, "and nothing to do it out loud until now." The magistrate's office was already crowded when they arrived because a Whitmore filing traveled fast in a small county, and the neighbors had come out to watch the scandal they'd been feeding on for weeks. Margaret sat at the front of the room in her good gray dress with Belle at her elbow, and Elizabeth felt the shift in her aunt's face the moment she walked through the door, the quick flicker of triumph there, and gone the look of a woman watching the trap she'd set begin to close. "There she is," Margaret said loud enough for the whole room. "The girl herself, come to answer for what she did, I hope. Magistrate Holloway. I've told you what she threatened me with in my own parlor." "You've told him a lie," Elizabeth said. The room went silent the way rooms do when someone says the exact thing everyone feared and half expected. Margaret's mouth tightened. "How dare you walk into this room and—" "I came to answer for what I did in your parlor, Aunt Margaret." Elizabeth went on, and her voice carried to the back wall without her raising it once. "And I will, in front of everyone here. I've nothing to hide anymore. That was always your privilege, not mine." She turned to the magistrate, a gray-haired man behind a wide desk, who was watching her with careful, unfriendly eyes. "Mr. Holloway, my aunt has told you I came to her house Monday and threatened her that I extorted her, demanded she sign over her estate under threat of false criminal charges. She's half right. I did go to her house. I did ask her to sign it over. She let that sit in the room a moment. Because it's mine, and I can prove every word of it. But before I do, I want this room to understand something. When you've heard the proof, I'm going to ask you for something that'll surprise every soul in here. I'll get to that. First, the truth." She set the tin box on the magistrate's desk. The sound of it landing was small, but the whole room seemed to lean toward it. "Mr. Pruitt's had every paper in this box a full week," Elizabeth said. "He'll tell you what they are." Pruitt stepped forward, like a man who'd been waiting a long time for this particular moment. He laid the papers out one at a time, slow and deliberate, naming each one as he set it down. The deed in Thomas Whitmore's hand. The discharged mortgage stamped, paid the ink worn soft with age. The will naming Elizabeth sole heir, signed and witnessed, dated 3 weeks before her father's death. And last he turned to face the room before he placed it the accounting Margaret's counsel had filed with the county court 7 years ago, swearing the house was mortgaged and the estate insolvent. "Compare the dates yourself, Mr. Holloway," Pruitt said. "The mortgage was discharged the year before Mr. Whitmore died. There was no debt remaining. The house was paid clear. The filing is false." He folded his hands. "And a false filing made to seize an orphaned minor's inheritance is a crime." The room stirred. Elizabeth heard the sound of it, the murmur shifting, changing the county that had spent a month eating Margaret's story, turning it over, now tasting something different in it. "Those papers could be manufactured," Belle said, rising quickly. "The girls had 7 years in that house to produce whatever documents served her. She didn't manufacture the boy." Nathaniel Carter stepped forward, and the room made space for him the way rooms always did, because 10,000 acres commands a silence even before a man opens his mouth. Behind him, the stable boy Samuel Reed came forward on shaking legs, hat twisted half to pieces in his hands. "This is Samuel Reed," Nathaniel said. "He drives Mrs. Hollis's cart. He drove Miss Whitmore to the Whitmore house Monday last and waited in the yard under an open parlor window on a hot summer day. Samuel, tell them what you heard. The truth, nothing added, nothing left out." The boy's voice came out thin at first and steadied as he went. He told how Miss Elizabeth had made her offer the estate, signed back the charges never brought, enough to live on freedom kept. He told how Mrs. Whitmore had spoken of prison, of the false filing, of what it would cost her if it came to a court, spoken it in her own words, without anyone asking. The way a guilty person sometimes can't help naming the very thing they're most afraid of. He told it plain without flourish, in the voice of a boy too poor and too frightened to invent a single word of it, and the room heard it exactly that way. Margaret had gone the color of old paper. "He's lying," she said, and it came out cracked down the middle. "Carter's bought him. Carter's paid him to say it. He's a widow's stable boy," Nathaniel said. "And I paid him nothing but the protection of keeping quiet till the moment it mattered. Ask him anything you like, Mrs. Whitmore. Have your Mr. Bell pull him apart. He'll say the same, because it happened the same, and there's nothing in that yard under that window he didn't see and hear with his own senses." Bell looked at the boy, then at the papers on the desk, then at his client's face, the guilt written there now, as plain as the false accounting. And he did the thing a smart attorney does when his client has led him into a crime he didn't sign on to commit. He sat down slowly. He put a careful, deliberate inch of space between himself and Margaret Whitmore, and he said very quietly, the silk entirely gone from his voice, "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe I must withdraw my representation." Margaret turned on him. "You cannot. You work for me. I work for my license," Bell said, "and my freedom. I filed that accounting on your sworn word that it was accurate. It was not. That makes me party to a false filing, and I'll not compound it by defending a complaint that this room has just watched collapse." He gathered his papers into his case with precise, unhurried movements, as though he were packing up after a routine afternoon. "I'm withdrawing from this matter effective now. I'd encourage you strongly to say nothing further without new counsel." He stood. He nodded once to Prewitt, who nodded back with the measured respect of opposing lawyers who've just watched the same truth arrive. And he walked out. The door closed behind him, and Margaret Whitmore sat alone at the front of the room, abandoned by her own attorney. Her carefully constructed story in ruins, on the magistrate's desk. 7 years of careful management and cold cruelty laid out in plain paper. And a stable boy's honest voice for the whole county to examine. And Elizabeth watched her aunt understand all at once that there was no move left. Magistrate Holloway had been reading through the papers in the silence, his gray face giving nothing. He set them down now and folded his hands and looked at Margaret the way a man looks at something he's seen before and never enjoyed seeing. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice had gone heavy with it. "I've known your family the better part of 20 years. What I'm looking at here doesn't give me any pleasure." He set his hand flat on the papers. "The record is plain. The filing is false. The estate belongs to your niece and always has. And the complaint you brought against her this morning on the evidence of this boy's testimony, and your own words as he's reported them, is itself a false swearing before this court." His jaw worked. "That's 2 crimes, madam. The fraudulent seizure of a minor's inheritance and a false complaint filed to cover it. Either one before this bench carries prison time, both together. Mr. Holloway." Elizabeth's voice cut across the room, and every head turned to her, including the magistrate's, and the look on his face said he was not accustomed to being interrupted mid-sentence, and was not sure whether he was annoyed or intrigued. "Before you continue," Elizabeth said, "I asked to say a thing when the time came, and I'm asking you to hear it before any sentence is discussed." Holloway's brows rose. "Miss Whitmore, this woman came to this office not 2 hours ago and swore under oath that you committed a criminal act against her. You've just watched the evidence prove her a liar twice over. Whatever you have to say, it can wait until after—" "It can't," Elizabeth said, "because what I have to say changes what I'm asking you for. and what I'm asking you for changes everything that follows." Holloway was silent a moment. Then he settled back. "Say it." Elizabeth turned to face the room, not just the magistrate, but all of them. Every face turned toward her in that crowded office, the county that had emptied pews around her and turned conversations cold when she walked in. The women who'd passed her the small nod. "You give a stranger? You've been warned about the men who'd nodded along to Margaret's story, because it was easier than questioning a woman of standing." She looked at all of them, and then she said, "I'm asking you to charge her with nothing." The room reacted the way rooms do when someone does the last thing anyone expected. A collective inhale, a moment of total stillness, and then the noise breaking all at once. She heard it around her, disbelief, confusion, somebody in the back saying, "Well, I'll be." And through all of it, she kept her eyes on Holloway, who was staring at her, the way a man stares at a word he's read 3 times and still can't parse. "You'll repeat that," he said. "I'm asking you to charge her with nothing," Elizabeth said again. "Not the false filing, not the false complaint, not a single count. Give me back my father's house and my father's name. Let the record show that every claim I made is proven true. That's all I want. The truth on the books, my father's truth and mine, and nothing more." "Miss Whitmore." Holloway's voice had gone very careful. "Do you understand what you are forgiving? This woman made you a servant in your own home, kept your inheritance 7 years under a false accounting, and this very morning stood in front of this court and swore under oath that you were a criminal in an attempt to send you to prison to protect herself." He leaned forward. "That is not a small thing to forgive. That is not a thing most people forgive." "I know exactly what I'm forgiving," Elizabeth said. "I lived it every day for 7 years. I know its weight better than any soul in this room." She turned then and looked at her aunt, really looked at her across that crowded space, the way she'd never let herself in all the years of keeping her eyes on the floor. "She's 52 years old. She's just lost everything she spent her life building. She came into this room this morning thinking she'd finally won, and she watched it come apart, piece by piece instead, in front of the whole county with her own lawyer walking out on her." Her voice didn't waver. "That's not nothing. That's a punishment as real as any prison, and she'll carry it the rest of her days." Elizabeth turned back to the magistrate. "I don't want her in a cell. She's my father's family. And whatever she is, whatever she did, my father loved her, and I will not do to her what she did to me. I will not take everything from someone who is down just because I have the power to do it. Because that is exactly what was done to me, and I know what it does to a person, and I'll not be the woman who does it to someone else, not even to the one who did it first." Bua. The silence that followed was so complete, Elizabeth could hear the clock on the magistrate's desk. Then someone at the back of the room started to clap. Just once, then twice, and then the sound moved forward through the crowd, the way a wave moves through water, and in 30 seconds the whole room was on its feet, and Elizabeth stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides, and her chin level, and her face burning. Not with shame the way it used to burn, but with something she barely recognized from want of practice. She was being seen, truly seen. Not as a servant or a schemer or a charity case or a rich man's fancy. Seen as herself, as the woman she'd always been in the corner of the room with the tray waiting for someone to ask her name. Margaret had not moved through any of it. She sat in her chair at the front while the room stood around her, and her face had gone through things Elizabeth couldn't name. Disbelief first, then a confusion that looked almost like pain. Then something that cracked open slowly, the way ice cracks in the first real days of spring. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow, deep fracture working its way to the surface from somewhere down very far. Holloway banged his desk twice to settle the room, and when it quieted, he looked at Elizabeth for a long moment before he spoke. "In 20 years on this bench," he said, and his voice was different now, rougher, lower, the official tone gone out of it. "I have not seen the like of what I'm watching this morning." He picked up his pen. "Let the record show the estate of Thomas Whitmore, including the house, the land, and all rents and improvements accrued thereon, restored in full to his daughter and lawful heir Elizabeth Whitmore, effective immediately." Let it show that every claim made by Miss Whitmore before this court today has been proven true upon documentary evidence and sworn testimony, and let it show." He paused, and Elizabeth heard him draw a slow breath, that at the express, unforced, and clearly stated request of the wronged party herself, no criminal charges are brought against Margaret Whitmore, who leaves this court a free woman solely by the grace and mercy of the niece she wronged. He set the pen down. "Miss Whitmore, the house is yours. It was always yours. I am sorry it took the law 20 years to say so. And it was done." The county filed out slow. The way people file out of church when the sermon has reached somewhere they didn't expect and they need a moment to find their footing again. Elizabeth felt the change in them as they passed the full nods this time. Not the social ones, the real kind that mean "I see you, and I was wrong about you." The women who'd avoided her eyes in the pew now meeting them and holding them a beat longer than politeness required. A man she'd known since childhood stopped and said simply, "Your father would have been proud, Elizabeth," and walked on before she could answer, and she was glad of it because she couldn't have answered. She had been a scheming servant when she walked in. She was walking out as something the county would not have a ready word for, because they'd never needed one before the woman who'd won the fight and spared the enemy and stood in the middle of the room and been larger than anyone expected, after 7 years of being made smaller than anyone should have been allowed to make her. Margaret was the last one left in the room besides Elizabeth and Nathaniel and Prewitt. And the stillness she sat in was the stillness of a woman who has reached the end of every story she ever told herself about who she was. She rose slowly. She crossed the room to Elizabeth, and she stopped in front of her, and for a moment she simply stood there, Margaret Whitmore, who had never in Elizabeth's memory been at a loss for words with nothing at all to say. "I don't know how to do this," she finally said, and it was the most honest thing Elizabeth had ever heard from her. "I don't know how to stand in front of you and say what I owe you. I've spent 7 years telling myself a story where I was the one holding everything together, making the hard choices, surviving. And I believed it. I needed to believe it." Her hands were shaking. "But you walked into this room this morning and told the truth about me in front of everyone I've ever known. And then you turned around and gave me back my freedom, and I don't—" Her voice cracked. "I don't have any story left. I don't know who I am without the story." Elizabeth looked at her aunt for a long moment. "You're a woman who's got time left," Elizabeth said quietly, "if you want to do something with it other than what you've done." She held her aunt's eyes. "That's not nothing. Most people don't get to know so clearly what they need to change. Most people never face the moment that shows them. You've faced it, and you're still standing, and what comes next is yours to make." She paused. "Charlotte's coming home. I've already written to her. And there'll be room in the house if you want it, or there'll be understanding if you don't. But either way, you go from here, a free woman with more years ahead than behind you. Don't waste them the way you wasted the ones you spent making me smaller. You're too smart for that. You always were." Margaret stared at her. "How can you speak to me like that?" she whispered. "How can you be kind to me after today?" "It's not kindness," Elizabeth said. "It's honesty, which I suspect you've had less of in your life than most, and more of it might have made you someone different." She stepped back. "Go home, Aunt Margaret. Think on it. The door's open or it isn't, that's your choice to make. But whichever you choose, you go free." And Margaret Whitmore went. She walked out of the magistrate's office into the afternoon sun, and Elizabeth watched her go. And the watching felt different from everything she'd expected. She'd imagined in her worst nights that seeing her aunt finally brought low would feel like something large and satisfying, like putting down a weight she'd carried 7 years. She hadn't expected that it would feel like this, quiet and a little sad, and mostly like relief that it was over and no triumph at all. Triumph would have required her to want Margaret broken, and she'd discovered sometime in the last month that she didn't. She only wanted her own life back, and she had it. Nathaniel was the last one in the room. He'd stayed back through all of it, the way he'd learned she needed him to present steady there if she reached for him invisible, if she didn't. He was leaning against the far wall now, with his hat in his hands, and when she turned to him, his face was open in a way she'd only ever seen it in private. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "She." "That was the most remarkable thing I ever watched a person do," he said. "And I've watched some remarkable things." He pushed off the wall. "How are you?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. Her chest felt like a room with all the windows thrown open after years of being shut raw with the new air, a little cold, more alive than it had any right to be. She felt scraped down to the bone, and also underneath it lighter than she'd been since she was 17, and her father was still alive, and her name still meant something in her own house. "I'm tired," she said. "And I'm all right, both at once, which I didn't know was possible until now." "That's what it feels like," Nathaniel said. "When you put down a thing you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight." He turned his hat once in his hands. "Come on. Let me drive you home, Elizabeth. Your home. The one with your name on the deed." He held out his hand. "You've earned the ride." She looked at his offered hand, and she thought of the first time he'd offered her his arm across that parlor. The cracked teapot, the apron folded on the desk, 7 years undone in one afternoon. And she thought of everything since the box in the cellar. The letter from Belle Charlotte on the Sunday morning. Margaret in the magistrate's office, the stable boy telling the truth in a thin, brave voice. She thought of how many times she'd stood at the edge of something and found against all expectation that she didn't fall. She was not the same woman who'd poured the tea. She knew that standing in that empty room with the magistrate's record drying on the desk, and Nathaniel Carter's hand in the afternoon light, waiting for her. That woman had been real, and she'd been necessary. The woman who hid the box and kept the books and swallowed the insults and stayed alive and waiting for the day she'd get to say what she knew. But that woman's work was done now. What came next belonged to someone freer. Elizabeth Whitmore took Nathaniel Carter's hand. "Let's go home," she said. The carriage came up the lane as the sun started its long golden slide toward the tree line, and the Whitmore house rose ahead of them against a sky that had gone every shade of summer. And Elizabeth sat forward to look at it. Her father's house. The house he'd built. The house he'd paid clear the year before he died, and meant to leave to his daughter. And she looked at it not as a place she served in, or a place she'd survived, or a thing she'd fought and bled, and spent a whole season of her life to win back. She looked at it as home. And then Nathaniel pulled the carriage to a stop, and he sat a moment without moving, and Elizabeth could feel him working up to something, the way she'd learned to feel the particular quality of his silences by now, the ones that were easy, and the ones that were carrying a weight. "I told you I'd wait a month," he said. "You did. I've been counting." "I know." She smiled just slightly. "So have I." He turned to her then, and the still face had nothing held back in it, the way it did sometimes in private, the way she thought probably almost no one on earth ever got to see it, because Nathaniel Carter had spent his whole adult life being wanted for his land and his money, and had learned to keep the real face at a safe distance from all that wanting. But he'd given it to her these weeks 1 degree at a time, and here it was now wide open in the long summer light. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said. "Not the formal way, not with the whole speech. I reckon you know what I'd say, and I reckon it'd embarrass us both for me to say it again out here in the road." He took her hand. "I just want you to know, Elizabeth, however you answer, and whenever you answer, what I feel for you has got nothing to do with the house or the deed or the fight or the letters, though all of it is you and all of it is why. What I feel is simpler than any of it. I want to come home to you. That's the whole of it. I want to come home to you every day of whatever's left, and I want to be the home you come back to when the day's done and you've been out there being extraordinary, and you want to rest." His voice had gone low and entirely unguarded. "That's all. That's every word I've got, and if it's enough, I'd be glad to hear it." Elizabeth felt something in her chest unhook from a wall it had been bolted to since she was 17 years old. "It's enough," she said. "It's more than enough. It's the only thing that was ever going to be enough." She turned his hand over in both of hers. "Yes, Nathaniel. The answer was always yes. I only needed to find my own ground first so I could say it standing up." And in the long gold light of a Virginia summer evening on the road in front of her father's house, Elizabeth Whitmore said yes, freely, fully, without rescue or obligation or debt, to the man who'd crossed a room for her when every other person in it looked past her and meant every syllable. The month did not go the way anyone expected, and it started with Charlotte. She came home on a Thursday coach pale and thinner than she'd left, and Elizabeth was standing in the yard of her own house when the coach pulled up, and the two cousins looked at each other across the dust of the road, and neither one moved for a long moment. Then Charlotte said, "Is it true what the letter said? That you sent for me? That you asked me home?" "It's true. After Mother sent me away for testifying. After I only found the nerve for one morning and then let her put me on a coach." Charlotte's voice broke. "You'd every reason to leave me in Baltimore, Elizabeth. I was a coward. I was a coward my whole life, and brave for exactly 1 hour, and you sent me the fare home anyway." "You were brave when it counted most," Elizabeth said. "That's more than most folks manage, and this is your home. It was never right that you lost it for telling the truth." She stepped forward. "Come in, Charlotte. There's a great deal to sort, and I'd sooner sort it with you than without you." And Charlotte came down off that coach and crossed the road and put her arms around her cousin, and the two women who'd spent 7 years in the coldest silence stood in the yard and held each other. And it was not the whole of forgiveness, because the whole of it would take years, but it was the true beginning of it, and both of them knew it. Margaret was harder. She stayed at first because Elizabeth had offered, and she had nowhere else. But she moved through the house like a ghost of herself, silent, watchful, waiting for the other shoe she was sure must fall. She could not understand a mercy that came without a hook in it. She kept looking for the trap. And it was near 2 weeks before the thing finally broke open, and it broke open over the account books. Elizabeth found her aunt in the study one evening, standing over the ledgers Elizabeth had kept for 7 years, and Margaret's face was wet. "I've been reading them," Margaret said, not turning around. "Your books. 7 years of them. Every rent, every debt, every dollar in and out of this house." Her voice was raw. "You kept them perfect, Elizabeth. Perfect. While I called you good help and worse. You ran this whole estate better than any man in the county in secret in an apron. And I never once—" She stopped. "I told myself for 7 years you were nothing. Because if you were nothing, then what I did wasn't cruelty. It was just managing, just what a woman does to survive." She turned finally, and her ravaged face was open in a way Elizabeth had never seen it. "But you were never nothing. I knew it. I think I always knew it. That's why I had to keep you down so hard. Because if I ever let you up, you'd be everything I was pretending to be, and I couldn't bear it." It was the closest thing to a confession Margaret Whitmore had in her, and Elizabeth understood it cost her everything to say it. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elizabeth asked. "Because I'm leaving," Margaret said. "In the morning. My sister in Baltimore's taken me in, and I couldn't go without saying it once out loud where you could hear it." She wiped her face. "You gave me mercy I didn't earn twice, and a roof I'd no right to, and I've spent 2 weeks trying to find the catch in it, and there isn't one. There's just you, being what your father was, and I can't live alongside that, Elizabeth. Not because you're cruel to me, because you're kind, and every kind thing you do shows me plainer what I am. That's a harder punishment than prison. You must have known that when you spared me." "I didn't," Elizabeth said honestly. "I only knew I didn't want to become you. The rest wasn't planned." "No?" Margaret said with the ghost of a broken smile. "No, I don't suppose it was. That's what makes it real." She reached out, hesitated, and then for the first and last time in 7 years, she touched her niece's face gently, the way she should have from the start. "Be happy, Elizabeth. Marry your rich man if he's half as good as he seems, and build something better than I did with everything I stole. That's my true wish for you. It may be the first honest thing I've given you. I'm sorry it took me so long." She left the next morning before the house was up, and she did not say goodbye, and Elizabeth understood that too, that some prides break only in private, and that Margaret going quiet at last was the kindest thing the woman had left to give. And then the house was Elizabeth's, truly hers. hers and Charlotte's and Amelia's and young Rose's. The four of them left to make something new of the place, and Elizabeth did not waste a day of it. She'd had 7 years to think, and nothing to do it out loud until now, and now she had a whole estate and a free hand, and the ideas came pouring out of her faster than she could see them done. She opened the account books to Charlotte and taught her the figures she'd once helped her with by candlelight, until Charlotte could keep them herself. She freed the 2 Field families her aunt had held in debt bondage on trumped-up ledgers. Elizabeth had found the false accounts years back and never had the power to write them, and writing them was the first thing she did. She hired the stable boy, Samuel Reed, who'd risked so much to tell the truth, and put him in charge of the horses at a real wage. And she began that first month the thing that would grow into the whole rest of her life's work, a school. It started small. A room in the north wing, the wing her father had built, and a dozen children of the tenant families who'd never had a letter of their own. Elizabeth taught them herself at first the way she'd taught Charlotte, the way she'd taught the little ones in secret for 7 years. Reading. Figures. The things a person needs to never be cheated out of an estate by someone with a lawyer and a lie. You're building it so it can't happen again, Nathaniel said, watching her one afternoon at the end of that month. He'd kept his word, he'd stayed away mostly, given her the room she'd asked for, come only when invited. What was done to you? You're making sure these children could read a false ledger if they ever saw one. I'm making sure they can read at all, Elizabeth said. The rest follows. A person who can read their own accounts is a person nobody can turn into good help against their will. She looked at the children bent over their slates. I spent 7 years being erased because I was the only one who knew what the papers said. I'd not have another soul in this county live at the mercy of what they can't read. Nathaniel was quiet a moment. It's been a month, he said. Elizabeth turned, and she saw in his still face that he'd counted the days as carefully as she had, that he'd held to his word, and waited and not pushed, and that he was standing here now, not to demand her answer, but to tell her the month was hers to end whenever she chose. So it has, she said. I'll not rush you a second time. If you need another— Nathaniel! She crossed to him. I've been standing on my own ground for a month. I've got my name on the deed, and my hands on my own life, and a school in my father's wing, and my family under my own roof, and I built every bit of it myself, and I know now, I know all the way down, that it's mine, and nobody gave it to me. She took his hand. And that's exactly why I can say yes now free and clear, and mean it as a choice and not a rescue. I don't need you, Nathaniel Carter. I want you. And I've learned this month there's a world of difference between the two, and that the wanting is the only kind worth marrying on. She smiled up at him. Ask me again. And Nathaniel Carter, master of 10,000 acres, who'd faced down her aunt and her aunt's lawyer, without a flicker found his voice was not steady at all. Elizabeth Whitmore, he said, will you marry me, not to save you, to stand beside you, for the rest of both our days? Yes, she said. Yes, now stop asking before I lose my nerve and have to think about it another month. He laughed the first full laugh she'd ever heard from him, and he pulled her in, and the children at their slates giggled and pointed, and Charlotte watching from the doorway put her hand over her mouth and wept for the good of it. They were married at the end of the summer in the yard of the Whitmore house under the big oak her father had planted the year she was born. It was not a grand wedding by the county's standards, and that was on purpose. Elizabeth had had enough of silk and settees, and women arranged like merchandise for a man to choose from. She wore a simple dress, pale blue cotton, the same shade as the one she'd worn pouring tea, and she chose it on purpose because she'd decided long before that she'd not be ashamed of the woman she'd been at her lowest, but would carry her right up into the best day of her life. Charlotte stood beside her. Amelia and Rose scattered flowers. And the tenant children she'd taught to read that summer lined the path holding their slates like little placards, and on each slate a word, so that walking down that line she read one child at a time. We wish Miss Elizabeth every joy. She cried at that. She'd not cried through the whole fight not once, but she cried at the children's slates. And when the vows were done, and Nathaniel Carter kissed his wife under the oak, The whole county that had called her a scheming servant 6 months before stood in the yard of the house she'd won back with her own 2 hands and cheered until the birds went up out of the trees. Margaret was not there, but a letter came from Baltimore in a hand grown shaky, and Elizabeth read it alone that evening and kept it the rest of her life. It said only that she'd heard of the wedding and that she was glad, truly glad, and that she'd taken to teaching her sister's grandchildren their letters of an evening the way you did for those tenant children. Elizabeth Thurster heard about your school, and I could not stop thinking of it, and that if a woman like her could find one good thing to do at the end of a life mostly spent the wrong way, she'd learned it late and second-hand from the niece she'd wronged. You taught me more by sparing me than 7 years of getting my way ever did. I don't expect that means much coming from me. But it's true, and you were always the one who cared for what was true. Be happy. You've more than earned it. M.W. Elizabeth wrote back. She always wrote back every letter for the rest of Margaret's years, because forgiveness, she'd learned, wasn't a single grand act in a magistrate's office. It was 1,000 small choices made over a lifetime. A letter answered, a door kept open, a hand extended again and again to someone who'd once refused it. And she found the choosing got easier every year, until one day she looked up and realized she'd forgiven her aunt entirely, not in a burst, but by inches, the way the truest things come. The years were good to Carter Valley. The school grew. What started as a dozen tenant children in the North Wing became in time the finest little school between the town and the mountains, and Elizabeth ran it herself for 30 years, and there was not a child born on Carter or Whitmore land in all that time who grew up unable to read their own name and their own accounts. Men came to her for advice on their land and their ledgers, the same men who'd once turned from her in the mercantile, and she gave it freely, and they learned to say her name with the respect they'd owed her all along. She managed the joined estates alongside her husband as a full partner, her hand on every account, her judgment sought on every decision, and Nathaniel Carter never once in all their years made a choice about the land without asking his wife what she thought, because he'd married her mind first and never forgot the worth of it. Charlotte married a good man of her own choosing. 3 years on a schoolmaster of all things, and the two families raised their children up together, and the cousins who'd shared 7 years of the coldest silence grew old as the closest of friends. Amelia found her voice in time away from her mother's control, and became a healer of some note in the county. Her gentle hands finally put to work that was hers. Even Rose settled and steadied and made something of herself. And Elizabeth. Elizabeth who'd poured the tea. Elizabeth who'd been called nothing. Elizabeth who'd hidden the truth of herself in a tin box in a cellar because she'd believed no one would ever want the woman behind the tray. Elizabeth Carter grew into the heart of the whole valley. Not because she'd married the richest man in it, but because in 30 years she never once forgot what it was to stand in the corner of a room and be looked past, and she spent her whole long life making sure that the people around her, the tenant, the servant, the overlooked, the girl pouring tea in someone else's house were seen. There is a story they still tell in that county of the summer day. A rich man came to choose a wife from 3 sisters in silk, and crossed the whole room instead to a woman in faded cotton, pouring tea in the corner. A woman nobody had introduced, nobody had named, nobody had thought worth a second glance. But that is only the beginning of the story and the smallest part of it. Because the true story is not that a powerful man saw her worth. The true story is that Elizabeth Whitmore had that worth all along, in the mind she'd hidden in the books she'd kept in the Mercy. She'd choose when revenge was hers for the taking, and that when the world finally gave her one chance to stand on her own ground, she did not use it to climb over the people who'd kept her down. She used it to lift up everyone the world had ever looked past, until a whole valley was better for the standing of one woman it had once called nothing, and that is the thing worth remembering. Long after the silk and the settees and the whispers have all turned to dust, a person's worth was never in the place the world put them, but in what they built, when they finally at long last got the chance to stand. And Elizabeth Whitmore stood, and never once sat back down in the corner again.